Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. I'm a professor of English literature at the University of Ottawa, and today's lecture is going to be an introduction to literary theory, an exciting field that I've been studying for decades now, and there's no end to the probing questions that various literary theories can pose for us. So I hope you'll join me on this journey. This is the first installment of a series of lectures that I'll be giving on literary theory as part of a course on contemporary literary theory. So English 3375 at the University of Ottawa. Our text for this course will be this massive tome. We won't read all of it, but this is where the readings will be taken from the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. This is the third edition. Most of those readings, if you don't want to purchase the text, if you're just following online and not taking this course, most of these readings are available freely online, so you can Google and find those. However, you will have difficulties if I'm referring to page numbers. You should be able to follow along, but that will be an issue. The page numbers I'll be referring to then will be from that anthology for the most part. Some of the readings are outside of this anthology. In the description, as always, there's the PowerPoint slides that I'll be presenting that you can download. There's the reading list for the course, as well as a link to the course website. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about what is literary theory, an overview of the course, talk about the theory wars of the 1980s and 90s and how that situates the theory landscape today. What I call the Nietzschean genealogy of contemporary literary theory. So you can see Nietzsche having a strong influence basically on all the theorists we'll be studying. And then the bulk of the lecture will be going over basic questions that are posed within literary theory. So what is literary theory? Literary theory is the study, I would say, of our ways of seeing literature. So theory comes from the Greek theorein, to consider, speculate, from thea, to view or aview, and horon, to see. So for the most part, we don't reflect on this. We assume that in reading a work of literature, we are seeing it as it is in itself, and we leave unquestioned the assumptions that constitute our way of seeing literature. So literary theory is a way of making explicit the assumptions that form the different ways of seeing literature. So if we were to define literary theory, the philosophical study of the methods, assumptions, and frameworks used to analyze literature, asks how does meaning happen, among other things. Literary criticism is the practice of interpreting and evaluating specific works. So if theory is the providing the theoretical tools, then criticism is the application. And critical theory is the study of social, cultural, and ideological structures that shape human life and is really analysis of how power operates. So these three terms are often used interchangeably. And for instance, in the course catalog for this course at the University of Ottawa, it's called critical theory. I will refer to it as contemporary literary theory because if you read the description, they want to talk about more than just critical theory. Critical theory is, strictly speaking, a specific method of the Frankfurt School of German philosophers and social theorists of the 20th century who are combining Marxist philosophy with social sciences to critique society. So it's a very specific cultural Marxist form. But often, as I said, people will use critical theory and contemporary literary theory and contemporary literary criticism interchangeably. So, as I mentioned, we'll be using this Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, but most of the works can be available online. If you're studying along, this can be an intimidating set of topics that we'll be looking at, and it may be useful for some of the schools of theory that we're studying to read something like the relevant chapters of Selden's A Reader's Guide to Contemporary Literary Theory. There are other works that provide similar introductions, short chapters on each of the schools, structuralism, deconstruction, and post-structuralism, that type of thing. So there's Terry Eagleton has a famous one, Literary Theory and Introduction. This Selden edition is a bit more up to date. There have been new editions provided with other authors. Here's an overview of the topics we'll be covering by week. So this week is an introduction to literary theory, the basic questions. Week 2 will be an overview of the history of literary theory, basically from Plato to the Romantics, so the background before contemporary literary theory. Then with week 3, we'll look at the perspectivism of Friedrich Nietzsche. Week 4, structuralism with Ferdinand de Saussure. Week 5, psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. Week 6, Marxism, obviously Karl Marx. 7, hermeneutics of Martin Heidegger. Again, hermeneutics of Gadamer. Week 10, esotericism in literature, an interesting theory posited by Leo Strauss. Week 11, deconstruction of Jacques Derrida. Discourse analysis, week 12, Michel Foucault. Feminism and gender studies, Virginia Woolf and Judith Butler. And then posthumanism, Rosie Braidotti. So I will say at the outset, this is a difficult course. It draws on the insights of many disciplines, primarily philosophy, but also linguistics, psychology, economics, sociology, anthropology, deals with abstract concepts, dense language, sometimes purposefully so. Sometimes the authors are trying to defamiliarize, so to speak, our everyday notions, our common sense assumptions. So they want us to stop at the language. And this leads to the common charge that contemporary theory is filled with needless jargon, and in some cases I would agree with that, but in some cases, as I said, it's purposeful. So it's difficult, but worth it. As Aristotle says, theoretical contemplation is the highest activity of humans. This is a quote from his Nicomachean Ethics. The activity of the intellect being contemplative seems to excel in worth and to aim at no end beyond itself. So as from Aristotle on, this type of theoretical reflection is the philosophic reflection generally is seen as the highest possible human activity, and although difficult, as I said, maybe our highest end. I want to set the stage a little with the theory wars in the 80s and 90s. I was doing my undergrad and grad school in the 90s, and this when I was taking literary theory, at that time, there was definitely a divide in English departments. There were maybe a couple of profs at the time that knew a little bit about these new theoretical developments and embraced them. Then there was the old guard that really disdained if you even took the one literary theory course that was offered. And there was a real rift in these English departments at the time. So the 80s and 90s were marked by these fierce debates over the place of literary theory in curricula of English departments and other disciplines. Structuralism and post-structuralism, so Derrida, Foucault, and others had become increasingly entrenched in academic conferences and journals. And part of the context there at the time is before these new theories came along, the reigning approach to the interpretation of literature was called the new criticism. Now for us, it's very old criticism, but at the time they called themselves the new critics. And if we were to try to summarize what that approach entailed basically three kind of tenets or approaches. First, adhering to the text as autonomous, this autonomous text, and adhering to it closely. So close reading. Now, this close reading of the new critics is really the lasting influence of the new critics. Almost all the theorists that we'll study still adhere in some way to this close reading, that with the notable exception of, and we'll only mention this school later on at the end of the course, digital humanities, where they're taking the new digital tools at our disposal, and actually Franco Moretti, one of the leading digital humanists, advocates for distant reading, so we can take a whole bunch of texts, and instead of looking at work by work, we can look at a field of literature. The new critics, on the other hand, had posited this single works as self-contained independent objects, and the need to focus closely on the words on the page, and not get distracted by external factors such as the author's life, historical context, reader response. They also stress formal unity and tension. So these critics would analyze how form and content interact, specifically focusing on how literary devices, metaphor, irony, paradox create tension and ambiguity that are ultimately resolved into a unified, harmonious whole. And related to the first, a rejection of intent and effect. So this approach rejects the intentional fallacy, trying to assume that we can use the work to figure out the author's intention, or the affective fallacy, assuming that the reader's response, the reader's emotional reaction, what have you, somehow has a bearing on the meaning of the work. So based on that point of departure, the old guard were adhering to these tenets of what's called new criticism, and with the reaction to the new theorists was, well, we should focus on the work itself rather than on these theoretical concerns external to the work. In addition, these new theories, these in particular post-structuralism, these new theories were calling into question the autonomy of the work. It was an anathema to the central tenets of new criticism. And the traditionalists also argued that we should approach the work in an unprejudiced way, rather than trying to force the work within the framework of a particular theory. However, the new theorists, so the post-structuralists and others, would argue in response that any untheoretical approach has certain unquestioned assumptions. In the words of Terry Eagleton, and that's a picture of the work I mentioned earlier, Literary Theory and Introduction, that could be useful. Terry Eagleton says, hostility to theory usually means an opposition to other people's theories and an oblivion of one's own. So if you say, I don't need a theory, I don't need to try to understand literary theory, you're basically approaching the work of literature with unquestioned theoretical assumptions of your own. So that's the point of departure of those who want to study literary theory and understand and articulate some of those assumptions. As I mentioned, contemporary literary theory, to a large extent, has a Nietzschean legacy. Now, I've tried to chart that out a little bit here, and I want to make this point just as a way of, as a pedagogical tool of trying to understand these theories, these theorists, and how they are, in a way, responding to Nietzsche. A lot of them, in a way, are responding to Nietzsche's history of nihilism, his declaration that God is dead, and we're living in the wake of the death of, let's say, truth and God and truth as an anchor for our understanding of the world. So what do you do in the wake of that? So Nietzsche, Heidegger, Strauss, Gadamer, I think that first generation, the first two generations, Heidegger, Gadamer, Strauss, in the wake of Nietzsche, are basically to a certain extent saying, well, we need to try to return to the tradition the French post-structuralists, which are the second wave after the ones I just mentioned, in a way are saying we need to accelerate it. We need to keep going in this direction of nihilism, and we'll try to understand that a bit further. The other thing to note here is we have a Nietzschean legacy, as I mentioned, and often the criticism of contemporary literary theory is that it's basically cultural Marxism. That's kind of the negative term used to describe a lot of the current theoretical concerns of English departments or humanities and social sciences departments generally. And there is definitely an influence of Marx there, and that contributes, beginning with the French post-structuralists, Deleuze and Foucault in particular, very, very much influenced by Marx. That contributes to this general penchant within the theoretical approaches within the social sciences and the humanities today to political activism and social justice. So that's definitely there. But I think philosophically speaking, the Nietzschean contribution in terms of living in the wake of relativism and nihilism and what that means for meaning, and the fact that that we live basically in a post-truth era, that structures the thinking of these theorists more profoundly. So Sewer will talk about in a future lecture, very influential, especially for these French post-structuralists in terms of our understanding of language and the structures of linguistics and how that shapes meaning and our interpretation of meaning. And of course, Sigmund Freud and his psychoanalytic theories. So this Nietzschean legacy begins obviously with Nietzsche at the late 19th century. The first generation to really bring Nietzsche to the fore of serious philosophical contemplation is Heidegger. He had a series of Nietzsche lectures in the 30s. Gadamer and Strauss were the next generation. They were heavily influenced by Heidegger. So they both attended a series of lectures on Aristotle in 22, 23, given by Heidegger, and were deeply influenced by Heidegger. So after Nietzsche, Heidegger, in some ways, probably the most influential figure in 20th century, 21st century literary theory and, well, philosophy generally. Via Heidegger, Foucault and Derrida picked up this Nietzschean concern with the history of nihilism, the death of God. Deleuze, in his own way, these three French post-structuralists, key French post-structuralists, Deleuze is unique among those three in having gotten his Nietzsche without Heidegger. He doesn't deal with Heidegger at all and almost disavows any interest in Heidegger. And then the last generation, basically the contemporary generation, a couple of theorists that are basically my age, Rosie Braidotti, influenced by Deleuze, we'll read her towards the end of the course, is her work on the post-human, is building on Nietzsche and Deleuze. Butler, Judith Butler, in terms of her work on the performative nature of gender and how that's formed gender studies and queer theory, directly taking Nietzsche through Foucault. Now, another way of thinking about the influence within contemporary theory of a few of the key figures is this concept of the hermeneutics of suspicion, raised by Paul Ricoeur. So Ricoeur, in his work, Freud and Philosophy, an Essay on Interpretation, he designates Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud as these key pillars, sometimes called the cultural triumvirate in terms of their influence, profound influence on all the social sciences and humanities, thinkers, writers after them. All three of them disclose a latent structures of meaning beneath a manifest level that we, or a surface level that we normally see. So in the political realm and the social economic realm, Marx will point out that we see political structures, we see legal structures. For instance, maybe we see the political structures of feudalism in the Middle Ages. That is only a surface that is caused by a deeper socioeconomic conditions. And similarly, Nietzsche will point out that conceptions of truth or conceptions of the thing itself, and this is kind of more on the metaphysical level or existence in general, are basically the epiphenomena of the ruling forces or perspectives or will to power that is underneath those highest ideas. And then in the realm of psychology, Sigmund Freud will say, our consciousness is basically the surfacing in a displaced form of our unconscious drives. So now let's turn to, for the bulk of the lecture, the basic questions posed by literary theory. So there's basically five, and there's sub questions to each of these, but we'll start with these five. The question of literature: what is literature? What are we going to take as literature? What's going on with literature when we interact with it? The question of interpretation: how do we discern the meaning of a work? The question of history: how do we relate to a literary work as past? And has profound implications when you think about it, in terms of this work as other. Are we going to allow its otherness to arise, or are we going to, let's say, absorb it within the frameworks of the present? A key problem, as an aside, a key problem with many of the political interpretations I find of historical works is taking, let's say, political concerns of the present and using them to critique or otherwise use it as a frame of reference the work of the past. You see that throughout all the historical works, but Chaucer, Shakespeare are notable examples. The question of value: how do we determine if a work is good or bad? And the question of the canon: how do we determine which are the works worth studying over time? So what is the canon, the set of great works that should be on English curricula? So for the first question, and to some extent for all of the questions, this fourfold distinction that M.H. Abrams makes in his famous work, The Mirror and the Lamp. So it was a critical assessment of the Romantics and how they changed the critical tradition. And he isolates in this diagram how there's the work in the center, and the work relates to the universe in terms of its mimetic pole. It is a representation or a mimesis of the universe to some extent, relates to the audience in terms of its effect, calls that the pragmatic, and it relates to the artist. The work can be seen as an expression of the artist's emotions or thoughts. Now, the classical tradition up to the Romantics had only concerned themselves with the first two poles, the relation of the work to the universe and to the audience. And then with the Romantics, the concern with the artist really starts to take hold. So let's look at this a bit more deeply. So in terms of the mimetic distinction, Plato initiates, if we go back in the history of literary theory, Plato initiates his criticism of poetry because its representation of reality is at two removes from truth. And in our next lecture, we'll look at that. We'll look at the history of literary theory, starting with Plato and going to a little bit more depth that criticism of poetry is at two removes from truth. Aristotle asserts that poetry is mimesis, just like Plato, but that it represents the universal or ideal, not particular things in the world. So he sees a positive power in poetry. And this classical understanding of poetry as representation or mimesis of the world out there is, as I said, holds true throughout the tradition from Plato to Alexander Pope, basically. For instance, Shakespeare has Hamlet assert this standard tenet when he says, the purpose of playing, whose end both at the first and now was and is to hold as 'twere the mirror up to nature, to show virtue her feature, scorn her own image, and the very age and body of the time his form and pressure. So contemporary literary theory, so some forms of Marxism and other political schools of criticism, such as feminism, gender studies, will continue as part of their analysis, not their sole analysis, this focus on how does the work relate to the world. So they might reflect on how does literature represent or reflect the social material conditions of their time, and to what extent does it, let's say, reflected in a way that covers it over, papers over the cracks, and ideologically justifies it so that we accept those social and material conditions. So that's a big part of Marxist ideological critique of literature as an ideological papering over and making it seem natural and justified the unjust material relations that are part of our day-to-day existence. So on the pragmatic pole, the relation of the work to the audience, Plato talked right from the beginning, talked about this. And for him, literature appeals to the emotions and can lead the audience astray. So for Aristotle, he also felt literature had an impact on the audience, but for Aristotle, it aroused emotions such as pity and fear in tragedy, but it leads to the catharsis of these emotions. So the purging or the purification of these emotions. Horace builds on Aristotle's positive sense of the power of literature and says that the effective work generates both profit, moral instruction, and delight or enjoyment. So in the 20th century, the new critics that I mentioned earlier, in the first part of the 20th century, claimed that focusing on the response of the audience or the reader would be an example of the affective fallacy. So the fallacy that the meaning of the work is my response to it. After the new critics, though, later theorists, particularly ones that focus on reader response theory and those types of theories, make the audience response to the work the sole ground for establishing meaning. And other theorists will focus on issues such as within structuralism and post-structuralism, the textual and discursive relations that structure an audience's response. In psychoanalysis, they might look at the psychological structures that influence an audience's reception. And then with Marxism, feminism, gender studies, that kind of bucket of political criticism, they might look at the ideological effects of the work in relationship to the audience. Now, the expressive pole, focusing on the work as an expression of the author's thoughts or emotions. So the classical tradition from Plato to Pope did not consider the author's intention basically at all. And it's only with the Romantic movement, for instance, Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, it's only there that we begin to see literature as Wordsworth says, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings of an author. So as we mentioned, the new critics reacted against the Romantic tradition and asserted that to focus on the intention of the author is to commit the intentional fallacy. So the intentional fallacy is seeing the meaning of the work or trying to ground the meaning of the work in a presumed intention of an author. So this is a very big question, and we're going to need to return to this question of authorial intention, I think, repeatedly, because I think in our average everyday understanding of what we need to do when we're reading something is we need to understand the author's attention. If I have my book clubs and we get into debates with my book club buddies about what's this all about, what's this book about, it's about, well, it often comes down, well, do you think that author meant this? That kind of question. So these are enduring questions. The authorial intention or our implied notion of what an author may mean is often our guidepost, I think, for understanding a work. The, the new critics point out, however, there are elements in a work that escape the conscious articulations of the author. So let's say we're reading a very long, complex work of Milton or a play by Shakespeare, and we find that there's connotations in this word, deep connotations because of its association or use by another author or in another image or metaphor that evoke a certain theme. Now, maybe that thematic was not consciously within the mind of the author when he or she wrote that work, but does that mean it's not there? And then, let's say another way of thinking about this, the author, if we let me back up for a second. Often, if you get into these debates, and I'll sometimes say to my book club buddies, right? So we have to base our understanding on the work itself. We can't assume we know what the author intended. So they'll say, okay, well, if authorial intention's no good, if the author came here and told us what the work is about, wouldn't that be kind of the final answer? So the new critics respond that say that even if the author is right there, and this is the case when the new critics were writing, you often had poets, the modernist poets right there, especially T.S. Eliot, telling you, okay, here's a footnote about this is what the wasteland's about. Here it is. It's about, the golden bough and descent into the underworld and all these things. The poet's there telling you this is what you should be thinking about. The new critics are saying, well, the author could be lying if even if they're there to tell us about the real meaning. And then let's say a corollary to that I would add is, even if the author's there and says, okay, well, the poem's really this, this, and this, it could be a lie on the one hand. The author could be mistaken in the sense that they didn't, as per the first point we made, that they weren't consciously aware of all the things that are happening in the language. And second of all, that statement becomes just another text to interpret. So we're back to the original problem. So the new critics will say, for all these reasons, we can't base the interpretation of the poem on a supposed intention, whether we have one at hand of the author or not, of that author. Now, contemporary literary theorists after the new critics, such as Roland Barthes, will declare the death of the author. So in a way, they're extending this critique further. So the author for within structuralism and post-structuralism is dissolved into a function of signifying relations and discourses. There's no independent human subject that can have free thoughts. This subject is dissolved into the functional relations of signifying discourses that form them. Okay, so Foucault calls the author merely a function. So he calls it an author function of various discursive and non-discursive practices. Now, on this point, it's good to pause and think about how traditionally there's been an analogy between texts and the created cosmos or world. So both texts and the world are complex and require interpretation to understand the design, the intention, or meaning behind them. So that's throughout the tradition. So through the Greek tradition, the biblical tradition, there's a corollary between understanding the text and understanding the world. Both are, let's say, signs of a creator, and we need to break down the intention behind that. Contemporary theorists who declare the author is dead are building on, to some extent, the earlier proclamation of Nietzsche that God is dead. So we can't anchor our meaning in that supposed creator, that supposed original intention and truth. That anchor for meaning is gone, both in interpretation of the world, i.e., leading to nihilism, and in our interpretation of texts, leading to a relativism of all possible interpretations. Now, finally, the objective pole. So the objective is focusing on the work itself as an autonomous object. So the classical tradition focused on literature as a representation of the universe and as having effects on the audience. But the classical tradition also considered the work as an autonomous form to some extent. And then in the 20th century, various formalisms, including new criticism and structuralism, emphasized the structures of the work itself. For the most part, however, contemporary theories dissolve the work into a web of textual relations. So we move from, in the words of Barth again, from work to text. So rather than thinking of the work as this unified autonomous object, the work is a text. And if you think of textiles as, you know, this woven threads, that's a good image often used by the structuralists and post-structuralists to think about how these textual signifying relations weave together in a network different relations, and there's no kind of discrete units that are somehow tied together. They themselves are constituted by this web. Derrida has a chapter of grammatology called "The End of the Book and the Beginning of Writing." So we talked a bit about these fourfold distinction to think about what's going on with literature. The other question we talked about is the question of interpretation. How do we discern the meaning of a work? And it's related to the fourfold distinction above. Where's the locus of meaning? Where's the place of meaning? Is it in the work, the author's intention, the reader? And what makes for validity in interpretation? If I, for instance, subscribe to a reader-centric approach, can I say that Hamlet is all about baseball because that's how, or what I think of when I read it? You know, I don't really think about baseball when I'm reading Hamlet, by the way. That's an extreme example. And a related question is, can we have an unbiased approach to the work? Can we have an objective understanding? This question is tied to how we understand language and history. Basically, all the contemporary literary theorists we're going to read will say no to that question, by the way. They'll say that, you know, language is not a transparent medium of communication. Language structures us and structures our particular approach to the other discourses we're going to encounter. And another related question to this is, how can we relate to the work as an artifact of the past, as something in history? Can we relate to it as an object of an objective piece separate from myself, or is it in history? This is going to be a central question we'll see with Gadamer, well, with Heidegger, Gadamer, and Strauss. So the problem of approaching the work in the past is the problem of history and interpretation, and it arises as a problem because when we're interpreting a work in the past, it has to do with questions of historical horizons. Can we transcend our own historical horizon? So if we back up and think about a horizon, what is a horizon? When I'm looking out in, you know, a landscape or a field, I can see from where I stand, from my perspective, I can see a certain distance. Some things are closer, some things are farther, some things are more important, some things are less important, right? Within a historical horizon. Now, the past, the work of the past, the author of the past, the readers of the past would have had different horizons that they're looking from, right? And can we transcend our own to understand the standpoint of someone writing in the past is an essential question. And And it's related to the question of interpret or communication generally. Can we transcend our own horizon to understand the perspective of another, or how do we do that when we're communicating with someone even in the present? So Gadamer will address this issue by pointing to the interaction of the reader and the work as a fusion of historical horizons. So there will be aspects of the historical horizon of the reader that do not intersect with that of the author or the text. So I, as a reader now, if I'm reading Plato, I live in a world with social media, with AI, with modern democracies and international relations. Plato's historical horizon did not have any of that. So there are going to be aspects of Plato's horizon that I cannot relate to, aspects of my horizon that are completely outside of the ken of that text and will not speak directly to us. However, there's going to be a great deal of intersection, so to speak. Now, it's those aspects, I think, which would point to some extent, enduring problems that are interpreted and reinterpreted over time in the tradition. Things that speak to us today that are speak to the enduring human condition. Why would I still want to read Plato? Because of that, there's a certain identity of problems. But also, even I may be pressured by seeing something that's completely alien and say, well, Plato thought of, within his horizon, that was completely seemed completely normal that uh, people should own slaves or this should happen. These political things that are outside of my horizon still raise questions and present our historical horizon as limited ones. They relativize the present and don't and remind us that there are other human possibilities. The question of value. Within the classical tradition from Aristotle and Horace to Pope, certain rules of poetic composition were discussed and understood as a set of criteria for judging the worth of literary works. And then with the Romantics, poetry comes to be seen as subjective expression. With contemporary literary theory, it's post-romantic. So we're no longer looking at an enduring set of rules of poetic composition, but even beyond the subjectivism, it's following Nietzsche, leading to a certain relativism where even the notion of a subjective standard is questioned. Finally, the question of the canon. So the canon comes from the ancient Greek word meaning measuring rod, straight stick, or standard. And in early Christianity, it referred to a list of scriptural books officially accepted as divine. And then by the 18th century, this concept was applied to secular literature. What is the canon of approved authors and works of excellence? Literary theory, beginning in the 20th century, starts to question this canon and leads to, in English literature, the various other disciplines, what was called the canon wars. Right? So why, with a whole bunch of questions being asked. And then I will say, so this happened 80s and 90s, again, tied to the theory wars. And the English canon has been broadened quite a bit since then, and rightfully so in many cases. But some fields are just catching up with this. I think, interestingly enough, philosophy is only recently going back to its past and saying, well, were there other philosophers there that we didn't think to pick up before? So, so part of the canon wars is about expanding the canon to say, okay, well, we only had certain set of authors represented in the past. Can we get a more diverse sample? But part of the canon wars is also about questioning the legitimacy of any canon. And it's there where I'm going to take issue with. Okay, so I think part of the canon wars were rightfully is rightfully a matter of questioning and always reevaluating what's in, what's out. And I think that's part of a healthy tradition. But dispensing of the tradition and the canon entirely is where I would personally is where I would stop. So what are some of the questions asked in the literary in these canon wars? So if you're one of these progressive contemporary literary theorists who are questioning the canon, you say, okay, who's deciding what's in this canon? So they'd ask us, you know, who holds the authority to decide which works are essential and which are disregarded? And and it's often elites in positions of power, so people who are setting the curricula in institutions or publishers, literary reviewers. So there's institutional nexus there. Ideology and power, rather than reflecting universal beauty and values, these critics would argue that the canon reflects ideologies, political and cultural power of dominant groups. Dead white guys is one argument I've heard in the past is a major critique is the lack of diversity in your typical canon that doesn't represent women, authors of color, etc. Then the problem of relevance. So if we call into question further, say, well, we're talking about a canon for university education or for us to read in the present. So we're talking about an increasingly diverse audience of maybe young readers. What's Chaucer and Shakespeare going to offer them? This is a point of respect. I think they have a lot to offer them. But the question of these critics is, what do these authors have to offer them? We should focus on authors that are closer to us temporally. Why go way back into the past and get these old dead white guys? Okay, so part of this has led to a certain, let's say, what I would call recency bias in the study of literature and history, by the way. And we'll come back to that. So if we are to defend the canon in response to these critiques, it seems we must point to enduring standards of the beautiful, the true, and the good, as opposed to the sense that these are all historically relative. Okay. And we must, to some extent, claim that these are standards applicable to human experience as such, transcending socioeconomic conditions, gender, race, as opposed to the sense that these are culturally relative. Okay, so if I'm saying that we should study Shakespeare today, and even if we have an increasingly diverse student population, I'm saying that Shakespeare is not a great author just because he speaks to a white male audience of the 16th and 17th centuries. I'm saying that he speaks to concerns that transcend time and transcend his own gender, his own race. So they speak to the human condition. I think that has to be the point of departure of defending any canon, is that those authors speak beyond their time and their particular situation, or else why would I want to read them at all? If they can't speak to me. So the canon has been expanded to include many previously excluded voices, and literary study has been expanded to include previously excluded genres, so graphic novels, fanzines, etc. So this expansion has just, as I said, it's always good to regenerate the canon, question and refresh it, but to some extent, the canon in the sense of what belongs in there has been expanded such that there's no distinction between what is literary and what are other forms of discourse. So now, rather than the study of English literature, we have the proliferation of culture studies and we're studying a set of cultural discourses where studying a car manual can be done just as profitably as studying Shakespeare. So if you go back to the question of the theory wars, to some extent, the traditionalists who were reacting against the theory that was coming in the 80s and 90s were correct, right? So the triumph of theory to some extent contributed to the establishment of various culture studies departments and the decline of the study of literature as distinct fields. So some data on degree completions in English literature, how it's declined over 35%, and then whereas communication and cultural studies has in that same period has increased 466%, and that's degree completion. So if you took enrollments now, I think it's even more more so the case. And then even those, even if you are studying English language and literature, what you're not studying the works to as much to as great an extent. You're reading critiques of the work, and this is the problem raised by I found a kind of an interesting grad student who had I forget the name of the YouTuber there, but she has a great video called "Why Do English Departments Hate Literature?" So she was a grad student at Columbia in English, but then dropped out because she wasn't learning about literature anymore. It was all about critiques of the literature, ideological critiques. So the traditionalists might have been right. And I say that with hesitation because I was one of those ones advocating theory in the 90s and saying that it was a great reinvigoration of our disciplines. And to some extent, it did lead to, it contributed to a decline in the study of literature. So it's contributed in relation to the replacement of the study of the works themselves with the study of political critiques of these works. It's contributed to the culture studies approach, where we deconstructed the canon and now study cultural forms generally. And it's contributed to this recency bias that I mentioned. So a narrowing of our historical horizon. This is, I won't go through this in detail, but if you can see the sources here, there's a website that collates hundreds of lists of great books and puts them all together. And then there's also this study of the topics of history PhDs in Canada that was recently published by the Canadian Historical Association. And in both the case of the great books, so basically literature, and in the darker blue, the topic of study of historical PhDs is heavily skewed to the 20th century, heavily skewed to the recent past, and then with smatterings of antiquity in there. So although theory may have contributed to some of these negative effects with respect to the study of literature, I believe that the best works of theory need to be added to the canon. It's not an either or question. So I think that's the problem. It's like theory taken to its extreme has called into the question the entire study of literature and the literary canon. So you can have the traditionalists who say, we avert your eyes, don't study it at all. And you can have the theorists who on the other side go so far to destroy what created them. But I think the best works of theory need to be added to the canon. It's not an either or. So if we take the perspective of trying to save theory from the traditionalists who want to just avoid it altogether, the best works of theory question our previous conceptions of literature, just as I would say the first philosophers and sophists did in Greece. So they started the quarrel of philosophy and poetry back in ancient Greece in the 5th century BCE. And that questioning, when coupled with the poetic devices of a Homer and the tragedians, led to the greatness of a Plato and became part of the canon. So the canon was expansive enough to include both Homer and the early philosophers. And so too, I think our canon should be expansive enough to include Austin and Foucault. And if we want to save the canon, from the other side, the theorists want to go so far as to destroy literature and the canon. Questioning of the canon, reinvigoration of the canon is not a recent phenomenon. It's been happening since the very roots of the canon itself in our Greek and Hebrew tradition. So the first philosophers took as their point of departure a critique of Homer and Hesiod. And so too within the Jewish tradition, priestly authors writing in the 6th and 5th centuries of BCE consciously rewrote and reinterpreted the stories of their ancestors in light of the experiences of the Babylonian captivity. So similarly, later in the modern revolution in thinking, Francis Bacon and Rene Descartes felt the tradition of authoritative text was precisely what they needed to dispense with so that they could approach truth more directly. So the Western tradition has been marked throughout its history by a destruction and recreation of its highest texts and ideals. And a critical reevaluation and reinterpretation of the text of the past forms the very basis of the tradition. And recent efforts to deconstruct the canon, therefore, are not a justification to abandon that canon and its tradition of critical inquiry. And the question is, how can we save this canon? There, I don't have good answers because of the state of the academic study of literature today. And that's a topic for another video. So those are some of the basic questions of literary theory in general. I hope it's piqued your interest to learn more about these theorists. The next video will be an overview of the history of literary theory from Plato to the Romantics. So we'll look at Plato, Aristotle, Horace, St. Augustine, Dante, Sir Philip Sidney, Alexander Pope, and William Wordsworth. And after that, in the third week, we'll look at Friedrich Nietzsche. As I said, when I talked about the Nietzschean genealogy, really the roots of all contemporary literary theory. So I hope you enjoyed that lecture. Thank you very much.